Here we are at the Oatman site. As you can see, the site of Oatman Massacre. It says February 18th, 1851, but actually in February 18th, they were still at the Pimo village. They were here in March. You'll see that date down there where their gravesite is. In the beginning, they were just a family who was going to a better place, looking for a better life. They were part of a Mormon church initially, and then ended up following this false prophet out here, and that quickly fell apart as the wagon trains, which left Illinois, moved westward on the Santa Fe Trail. And unfortunately, because of the difficulty of the trip, they were losing wagon after wagon, family after family, who were dropping out of the trip, until there were only 3 families, 3 wagons. And they were not far from here at a Pimo village, which was an Indian village. It was friendly to the settlers and to whites, and who would defend themselves against the marauding Apaches and the Yavapai, whatever tribes were trying to attack them for their food, which happened on a regular basis. The pioneers had arms and were able to defend themselves. And according to the book that was written by Stratton and Olive Oatman and Lorenzo Oatman, they were able to defend themselves. And the Apaches, they had respect for that, and they didn't usually attack these settlers because they knew there was a price to pay. However, this case was different. So in this Pimo village, the Indians were literally almost starving anyway. And but 2 of the families elected to stay there and wait for a while before they left, even possibly up to a year, thinking they had a better chance getting to Yuma if they had rested all their livestock and they didn't starve. The Oatmans, on the other hand, Mr. Oatman, he felt like, hey, if my family's going to starve here, I might as well try and make my way to Yuma, which is 90 miles from this spot right here. And so, as they were trying to decide in this village what to do, what was the best course for their family, this doctor, this Mr. LeConte, this Dr. LeConte, had just come from Yuma and was at this village and informed them that he had not even seen any American Indians of any tribe on the way here, and that he was going to make his way back to Yuma as well. And so that was the turning point for Mr. Oatman. He's like, well, if there are no threats of getting attacked between here and Yuma, then I'm going to take the chance and see if I can't get my family to Yuma. And so that being the turning point, they left the safety of the Pimo village and began working this way. And the road they were traveling on was created, at least the wagon road was created by the Mormon Battalion, who had been commissioned by the U.S. government to build a wagon road along the Santa Fe Trail that would lead to California. And that was their goals. But right now, their immediate goal was just to get to Yuma because there was food there was safety there, and that's what he wanted more than anything else. So my purpose here is to talk about the survivor, how Lorenzo and Olive survived. That is the purpose of this video, how they did that and what transpired, this dramatic and tragic event. And yet, this young lady, who was only 14 years old when it happened, and just barely 14 years old, survived all those years in captivity. And now, as my primary reference, I'm going to actually use the book that Stratton, Olive Oatman, and Lorenzo Oatman actually wrote in 1858, and was copyrighted, I believe it was copyrighted in 1857 by Lorenzo Oatman himself. So they were eyewitnesses, they were there. Throughout the book, they are referring to the Indians that attacked him as Apaches, the Tonto Apaches to be precise. Now, the territory that they're in was a Yavapai, but it is not uncommon for Native Americans to pass through other territories. Now, we'll pick the story up when they left the Pima village, or Pimo village. When they decided to make a run for Yuma, they were not in good shape. They had 2 oxen and 4 cows, and none of them were in good shape, and they felt that if they stayed in the area they were in, there wouldn't be enough grass for them to get in good shape anyway, and they probably would end up eating 1 or 2 of them. So with this in mind, they had to pull a heavy wagon, and the terrain here is rough, and I'll show you the wagon road that they came up, and you can see the ruts in the rocks from the wagons as they came up these hills. This is the wagon road they came up. You can see where the wagon wheels came up through here. Look at that. How cool is that? Yeah. You can see down here is the Gila River. They camped the night before the massacre on a sandbar in the middle of the river where they had water flowing on both sides. They were exhausted just to get here, the few days it took, because the oxen and the cattle were such bad shape that they would just stop and they couldn't get them to move. And so they would have to unload the wagons and then carry the goods or their possessions a distance, and then get those oxen and cattle to move the wagon with their help pushing on the wagon to get them to make any ground. This very road that is right here that I'm going to show you, they had to unload the wagons, carry all their possessions up this hill, and then go back down and help push on the wagon. And even then, the cows and the oxen would stop just because of sheer exhaustion. The cows and the oxen would stop just because of sheer exhaustion, because they were in terrible shape. They needed at least a year to get back in shape. And they ended up camping up here. And so they were up here resting. And they were setting up for camp. And Lorenzo, who was closely watching his father, saw the Indians coming from a distance. So they did not take up arms and show any signs of resistance or force. When the Indians came to the wagon, they came with friendly gestures of peace. We're friends, speaking in the Spanish dialect, which Mr. Oatman and Lorenzo both spoke fluently. And so the Indians coming in peace, everybody felt, well, okay, but there still was this tension in the air. There was still this anxiety. And we were exhausted because they had just come up this hill and they were ill prepared to defend themselves now, especially without weapons. They asked for tobacco so they could, in the way the term used to be, smoke the peace pipe to show that they were friendly and meant them no harm. And so Mr. Oatman produced some tobacco, which he smoked and they all smoked together as a demonstration of peace and goodwill. And then the Indians there demanded food. Well, their situation was pretty dire already, because they may not even have enough food as it is to get to Fort Yuma for his own family. And he told them that their situation was very, very dire, and that they probably didn't have enough food for themselves, and that if he gave any food to anybody else, it would cause his family to starve. But they demanded he give them food. And so he reluctantly gave them a little food to eat, which was not enough. And they started becoming more demonstrative, standing up, yelling. Some even got up and searched the wagon thinking he was holding back and didn't believe his story. But at this point, what else could he do? He could not give them food. He didn't even have enough food for them and his family. So, after getting them out of the wagon, the Indians moved off by themselves. Tensions were high now. I mean, if they were ever high, they were at an all-time high now. And these guys, the Oatmans, were seriously on edge and fearful for what was going to happen. And so they began packing up their stuff and putting it in the wagon as the Indians stood off to the side and began speaking among themselves in their own dialect, looking at the Oatmans as they spoke. This interchange that they just had was not a good one. The tension got to a point where the Apaches, or the American Indians, moved off to the side, gathered amongst themselves, and began speaking in their own dialect. Because before that they were speaking in Spanish, which the Oatmans were fluent in, and the Apaches were fluent in. But now they were speaking their own dialect, and the Oatmans could not understand what they were saying. We have a clue what they were doing because of the results. You could probably only imagine the dread and the fear that was described by Lorenzo as they were breaking out in sweats. Their mouth was dry as the desert. The only people who didn't have any fear was the 2-year-old girl and the little boy not much older than her. The little girl was sitting on a rock holding the rope of the oxen, the lead oxen, totally oblivious to what was going on. But Lorenzo, Olive, even Marianne, the 4-year-old, knew what was going on. The mother, in just desperation, grabbed the little boy and held him close to her body. There was an 18-year-old girl there, the oldest daughter. None of them could speak, and what they were doing was they were putting all their stuff back in the wagon to try and move out of there before this thing escalated. The father was ghost white, just this gray, pale dread on his face, according to Lorenzo. In the meantime, the Apaches were looking at them and then talking amongst themselves and looking at them and talking amongst themselves. And what they were really doing was they were planning the attack. And when it happened so suddenly, there was no time to react. The first thing they did was grab Olive. They grabbed young Olive Oatman and pulled her off to the side, so we know they planned on taking her as a captive right away while they were discussing it. The very next thing they did was they started clubbing Lorenzo with their war clubs, which they had hidden underneath their wolf skin clothes. Soon after, or just almost instantaneously, they began clubbing the father. In the meantime, the mother is screaming out, dear God, someone help us." Lorenzo then passes out and the story is handed off to us from Olive, who was witnessing what was going on. We heard a little screech from him, she says, and that was it. He was silent. The mother did not die instantly. She laid there moaning, blood pouring out of her ears and her eyes. Olive, in terror, began to faint and pass out. And then when she came to, which was only for a few seconds, she saw that they had taken Marianne, the 4-year-old, and drug her away from the oxen and put her next to her with 2 of these Indians guarding them. When Olive got up to run to her mother because her mother was moaning, the Indian grabbed her and threw her down and said, "Look, I'm going to hit." Didn't say, he told her, "You're going to get hit with this club," threatening them with the club. There were words being spoken she could not make out from the people who were dying, her family, dying all around her, blood all around her. The trauma of it was probably something we cannot imagine unless we had lived through it. Lorenzo laid there in a pool of blood, blood coming out of his ears and out of his mouth. Right over in here. He was right over in this area here. And the Native American took his foot, rolled him over with his foot, and began searching his pockets for anything that he could keep and be useful for him. He took his shoes and his hat from him, and then he drug him by his feet and threw him over the side. That ended up being something that saved his life. They then began ransacking the wagon. They took the wheels off of it, so it looked like it was a problem and the people abandoned their wagon. Because remember, they were afraid of the retaliation of the white soldiers and the white settlers, who they feared was coming. They pulled out all the possessions they wanted. They took all the livestock. Then they went over to Olive Oatman and Marianne Oatman. They removed their bonnets and took off their shoes and made them walk bare feet, heading northeast, this way here. Back down the road they came, this way here. The first night they made camp not more than a couple miles from here. I can only imagine that Olive was in utter shock. All Marianne could do was cry and hang on to her. The pace that the Indians set to leave was quick because they didn't want to be discovered at the site for fear of retaliation. And for the next few days, they moved at a very rapid pace to get out of the area so they couldn't be associated with the massacre. Now Lorenzo was drugged and thrown over the hill. And that probably saved his life, because after they had gotten their possessions, they went around to make sure that all the victims, the murdered victims, were dead. To make sure there was no one living who could tell the tales of what happened. Lorenzo would wake up later that night, but be so out of it, so knocked into oblivion, that he would just come to consciousness and go out, come to consciousness and go out. In the meantime, his sister was a few miles over there. They threw him over the side. And slowly, after a day or two, he was able to move. And if you read their book, you'll see, as he describes what took place. Not knowing what actually had happened, thinking that possibly everyone in his family, because he hadn't seen anything, because he was down on the side of the hill, and he had not seen anything yet that would indicate that anyone survived. nor did he hear any noises. At one point he lifted himself up in the moonlight. He could see a part of the wagon. Eventually he came to his senses, and with a splitting headache managed to get up on his knees and began to crawl on his hands and knees for a little ways. He figured he would do his best to crawl to wherever he had to go. And he decided to crawl. He decided to make his way back to the Pimo village. On his way back, he was attacked by wolves. And two Pimo Indians that came upon him. So in his escape and attempt to get to the village, two Pimo Indians actually came upon him and drew their bows because they weren't sure. I mean, here was this human being with blood, dried blood all over him. The blood was so bad he couldn't see until he was able to rinse the blood out of his eyes, the dried blood out of his eyes so he could see again. And when he hollered out to him in Spanish, "Please, please, I'm a human being," they put down their bows, and they were kind enough to help him. And they gave him some food, some water, and said, "Stay here. We're going to go to the massacre site." Well, he didn't. He decided not to stay there. He went on until the two families that had stayed at the Pimo village came upon him. Lorenzo was taken to Yuma by the two families. Not before they stopped here. And buried their family. Now the ground was so hard, and this ground is hard, that they couldn't bury him underneath, so they stacked rocks on him, and later they would be buried down over there. We'll get to that part. I want to bring you back to LeConte. Now, before the massacre, this Dr. LeConte had overtaken them on his way back to Yuma. And seeing the sad state that they were in and the desperation, the desperate situation they were in, he promised to send back people and supplies from Yuma as soon as he arrived there. Unfortunately, not more than a day's ride from here, because it's 90 miles from here to Yuma, him and his Mexican guide were attacked by Indians, which they called Apaches too, and granted, a lot of times they blamed everything on the Apaches. We don't know who they were for sure, but they were able to fight them off. But in the meantime, while they were fighting them off, their horses and their mules were stolen, so they had to walk the 90 miles to Yuma. By the time they got there, the supervisor or the commanding officer said, "No, I will not send troops over there," because on this side of the Gila River, look, on this side of the Gila River over here, this was all a part of what is called Mexico at the time. On the other side was the United States, and he would not send his troops into Mexico to rescue this family, regardless of how much Dr. LeConte urged him to. 2 volunteers, and there were a lot of people wanting to volunteer because they had heard, you know, the sad state, and they would come over there all in their own time. 2 volunteers did come over here, and all they found was bones. And they could make out all the people who were there except for Lorenzo and the 2 girls. So they did not know what happened to Lorenzo. They did not know what happened to the 2 girls. They just assumed they were all captives. He left a note that was found by the 2 other families who were following behind him, saying that, explaining what happened, and that there would be a delay, but as soon as he landed there, he would have the people from Fort Yuma send troops back. But it wouldn't have mattered at this point. Shortly after he left them, they were attacked. Olive would be in captivity for years, although some would question whether she was held captive, because traders would come, railroad workers would come, and they never saw her. They didn't realize she was there until one day a trader did come. And somehow or another he found out that there was a white girl, a white captive in the camp. And so when he spoke to the chief about it, the chief acknowledged eventually that there was. So word got back to Fort Yuma that there was a white girl in the Mojave camp. And they believed it was Olive Oatman. You see, Mary Ann had died in the famine due to no fault of the Mojaves. They were kind, she says, and tried to help them stay alive during the famine, but she starved to death, little Mary Ann, amongst the Mojaves. And so they sent for Lorenzo and brought him to Fort Yuma. He was living in California, trying to raise money to come and find his sisters, which he felt was alive. And the military commander sent a messenger along with this trader to the Mojave village, and it went something like this, and I'm going to paraphrase it for lack of a better way of saying it, but ultimately it said this: we're going to offer you something to trade for the white captive, and if you do not trade her to us, we will come and wipe out your village. That should give you an indication of how the American settlers and military personnel felt about white captives being held by American Indians. And I don't believe that it was just a threat. I believe it was a promise. Now the chiefs got together, and the elders of that tribe, and discussed 3 options. 1, kill the Oatman girl and deny she was ever there. 2, refuse to trade the Oatman girl and take a chance of having all the people wiped out by the U.S. military. Or 3, do what the military said and trade. And ultimately that's what they did. Now when they came to trade for Olive, she did not want to go. She only spoke Mojave. She did not speak English. She was assimilated into the tribe. Fully assimilated. But the Mojave people said, no, you have to go for the sake of us. And so she left. Now I believe she left behind children and a husband, at least children. And I'll explain why in a little bit. Upon arriving at the fort, the commander was presented with Olive Oatman, and he said, this is a Mojave, this is not a white girl. And one of the sergeants pulled up the back of her hair because she was just dressed in a grass skirt, no top. And she looked dark and looked just like one of the Mojave Indians. And when he pulled up the back of her hair, they could tell she was a white girl. She only spoke to them in Mojave. Lorenzo was there and did not even recognize her. Now remember, she was only 14 years old. She's like 19 years old now. And she had gone through an awful lot, and I'm sure she had aged quite a bit too. She didn't want to be there, but she knew she had no choice. And I believe the Mojaves convinced her to leave her children behind. And she was very defiant. She did not like American civilization, and that was put mildly. And so she needed to be assimilated back into the American culture, and they took her across the river to a, well, what was really, we're not sure if it was a brothel or not, but there was a woman named, they just titled her the Westerner, and she assimilated her back into the English language and the American culture. But she bore the tattoos on her arms and on her chin. And I'll show you pictures of these. Now, there's a lot of different discussions that, oh, captives did not get tattoos. Well, in fact, yes, they did. That is just some nonsense. But also, the Mojaves would tattoo themselves completely, their whole bodies sometimes. The tattoos on the chin, though, we have learned, represent a Mojave wife, which is interesting. So once assimilated back in and reunited with her brother Lorenzo, they had a lot of healing to do. A lot of healing. And here we have a young woman who, from the American culture at that time, she would have been considered of very little value to other men if they had felt that she had sexual relationships with Indians, because they would have felt that she should have killed herself first. But she took the position, and this is why I believe she took that position, that they respected her chastity, that they did not molest her in any way, none of them. And the odds of that being true are, I'm not trying to be controversial, but the odds of that being true are not very good. So, she had no way of making a living and supporting herself. She didn't even like the culture she was now forced to live in. Lorenzo had no way of making a living. And so this minister, this Methodist minister that has caught a lot of flack because of the culture of that time and the perspective of the Indians at that time, out of Eureka, California, approached them and said, look, let's write a book about your experiences. And so Olive and Lorenzo both got together and collaborated with him. And the book was, as I said before, it was copyrighted in 1857 by Lorenzo himself. So we know that it didn't happen without their knowledge, and that they weren't a part of the writing of the book. And I honestly can tell you, I don't see how they romanticized any of it. Some of it was downright disheartening, some of it was discouraging, some of it was just straight out anger because of what they had to go through. And they eventually went on a tour for the book, because the book instantly sold out more copies. And then the next edition came out, and it instantly sold out. And then the next edition, and it instantly sold out, because the people were like, oh my gosh, the girl with the blue tattoo. And so she would tell her stories. Now, why she was in New York, and this is one of the reasons why, as an indication that she did not have terrible feelings about the Mojave, even though, and she said she didn't. There was a chief of the Mojaves that decided to go and tour the U.S. to see what the white man's world was all about. And while he was in Washington, she took a train to meet with him privately in the lobby of the hotel he was staying in, and had great conversations with him, and he asked her why, when, and he called her by her nickname, Rotten Womb or something like that. When are you going to come back to your people? Well, she never did, because during one of her lectures, she met a rancher in Texas, a wealthy rancher, and that rancher married her. and took her to Texas, where she would live the rest of her days. She could no longer have children, but they did adopt one child. The rancher was so furious about this identification of his wife in this book and these Mojave Indians, because remember at that time, I'm sure he took a lot of flack about it from other men. He went around and started buying all the books he could that was published by her so he could have them destroyed. The public's hunger for her story was so great that it just kept going on and on. Now in 1965, now when she was 65 years old, before she passed away from a heart attack, she wrote a letter stating how she missed her mother and wished her mother had been there with her. I don't think something like that ever leaves you. Now, why am I sharing this story? Because I've been fascinated over all these years by this young lady who had the courage and the fortitude to survive all that she survived. The young man, her brother, courage and fortitude to never stop looking for his sister. Because he could have just moved on with his life, but he never stopped. If there were ever a tale of survival, this was it. Now, if you like this sort of thing, hit that like button. And if you want to see more of the content like this, hit the subscribe button. I can say that word again, subscribe. You can even share the video if you like. I think we ought to take what we've learned from this young woman and her brother and realize that once the human spirit decides that it wants to survive, it will do what it needs to be done to survive. Never underestimate the human spirit. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for making it this far. God bless.